Let us start by chanting Namo Tassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. All right. So we have now reached the immaterial consciousnesses, right? We have reached the immaterial consciousnesses, which for the comprehension of those who have not reached the state of upekkha, or rather understood or felt the conditioning or the thought processes which arises within a person with upekkha, it could be quite challenging to understand the significance of certain types of the significance of certain techniques of practice which goes into the immaterial jhanas, because the immaterial jhanas, they speak of a type of consciousness that we mundane people don't really understand up until we do come into that stage. The subtle natures which operate when we do develop the fourth jhana, or the fifth jhana rather here, the fifth jhana, because we are talking about Abhidhamma. But if one does sort of dwell into the path of purification, which is a book, the path of purification, which is like almost a Bible for meditators, it would be spoken of in the sutra way, to sort of, they would use the word fourth jhana. But please understand, if you do dwell into the book, please understand when they are referring to the fourth jhana in the Visuddhimagga, they are actually referring to the fifth jhana in the Abhidhamma. Now, the fourth jhana, as we have just gone through it, the fourth jhana, or rather the fifth jhana, has two attributes or two factors or jhana factors, which we recognize as upekkha, equanimity, and one-pointedness, right? It is through this basis or this step or foundation that we are able to progress into the arupa jhanas, Now, I have heard, or rather it has been sort of, I have heard of certain meditators who sometimes say that they are able to develop the upekkha, or go into the stages of upekkha without developing the former jhanas, meaning the 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Abhidhamma context. Now, there is no sort of evidence that we find within the Pitaka or the Visuddhimagga or later texts which says that this is possible, right? Also, from the traditions that we know from today, the Pauk traditions, which is famous for its samatha and vipassana, or samatha jnanika vipassana, which is where in the practice you do samatha before vipassana. They do speak of going through these jhana steps specifically because what happens as you progress in the jhanas is your mind is able to now tap into more subtle states and see more finer phenomena in ways that we first was not able to see it. Now, for example, no examples. We are going to speak about it. We are going to speak about it as we go on. That example would complicate stuff. But before we move on to the Arupa jhanas, I want to just recap on what we have done or the consciousnesses that we have gone through for the past couple of weeks, right? The consciousnesses that we have gone through for the past couple of weeks. Now, we have gone through the sensual sphere or kama vachara chittas, right? Kama vachara chittas. What are the kama vachara chittas? The kama vachara chittas are those which predominantly arise. You cannot say arise in, because that would say that it only arises within the sense sphere. Predominantly arises within the sense sphere planes. These consciousnesses sometimes arise in other planes as well, right? In other planes as well. How do we know of this? For example, there are occasions within the Pitaka which speaks about wars between the gods, wars between those who sort of those gods who, of course, they also belong to the Kamavachara plane, but it also speaks of an event where now, if a being who lives with a very subtle form, now please understand, the higher the merit, the lesser the form is, if you've already understood this, right? The higher the merit, the lesser the connection to form is, right? Now, if we speak about the divine realms, now I hope that you've gone through the planes of existence, right? If we go or look into the divine realms, we find texts that speak about the sort of the soft silks and the very, very fine material, the sort of clothing that drapes the bodies of these deities, right? It always associates something which is very, very, very fine, right? Very, very fine. And this attributes to the consciousness as well, because a person who is able to, for example, reach a state of divinity reaches such a stage by letting go of the gross petty attractions and attachments that we have in our life. For example, now if I am sort of gloating over, now this bottle is quite famous, right? Because I'm using it as an example for many classes, right? So if I'm gloating over this bottle, right, this is something which is very petty, like most of the things that we cling and attach to. Sometimes we are gloating over the houses that we have. This might be a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom, whatever it is. But compared to a palace, it is nothing, right? But because we attach ourselves to certain phenomena or certain materialistic engagements, we find that the mind is unable to prosper and develop, right? That the mind is unable to prosper and develop within this path of practice, right? Let's leave aside the path of practice. Even if one is to reach states, if we are to take the Vedas, if we are to take the teachings of ancient religions, it always, now even if we take something as Catholicism or Christianity, right? It speaks about a practice where one connects to God, right? It doesn't speak about, and where one sort of practices generosity, one practices sort of a letting go in a way where one now focuses on God. If we take ancient religions such as sort of Brahmanism or Hinduism, or something as even more ancient into the Vedas, where the practice of the rishis come in, all of these people with significant interest to flourish in a way that they go beyond the world, we find a doctrine, a teaching with regards to letting go of what you currently have, right? Now, even in the study of the jhanas, which we are going to continue after we recap on what we have done, one might understand, you might understand for yourself, how do we progress upon the path of jhana or absorptions? How do we do it? We let go of the first jhana by allowing ourselves the wisdom, the understanding to understand that the first jhana, although it might be something which is new to us, something that is predominantly something that is blissful and pleasurable, but as we master the jhana, we are able to realize that the specific or respective jhana factors which exist within that jhana makes the jhana gross, heavy, weighty, busy, right? And in understanding that and letting go of that, we are able to sort of go into, right, go into the second jhana. That is how you flourish. Now that says a lot about our lives as well, right? You try to develop something, you try to develop some sort of spiritual practice, you try to develop a higher state of mind, you try to develop even something just as compassion, right? Even something just as compassion, but you keep on holding on to the mentalities that arose in the past. You keep equating your personality and your life to what you've done in the past. So what that connection that holds you down to the past keeps you in similar states, in parallel to what you've experienced in the past. Likewise, it is important to understand that it is this flourishing and development is existent where you are able to let go, right? To put things in the past and leave it there and allow yourself to flourish into the present moment, or some would even say the future. Whatever it is, we do flourish when we do let go of certain things in the past. But the letting go, always remember, I am not taking the risk for you to misunderstand. This letting go is not covering it up. In Pali, we call it Tina Vattaraka. Tina is grass, Vattaraka is cover. To cover something with grass, twigs, branches, like we would do to maybe here of course you clean it up, but in sometimes Asian countries, when dogs poo and leave some sort of droppings or whatnot, whatever you call it, we sometimes cover it up, or we cover things which are not so pleasant, we cover it up, right? Likewise, this is not a covering up that we're doing. We let go through understanding through fear. Fear, when I use the word fear is associated, the word fear would usually be associated with a hatred rooted consciousness, or hatred root, right? But the fear that we are speaking of here is the fear of bad, which is a wholesome, wisdom filled action. For example, to fear wrong is something which is good, right? Because the reason that sort of fear arises, the base of that fear to arise is your need to be wholesome and good. Hence, you fear wrong. Because the base is something which arises through understanding, it is a consciousness which is more along the sides of a wholesome consciousness, a wisdom-rooted consciousness. Wisdom-rooted consciousness. There are incidents where, coming back to the Kama Vachara plane or the sensual sphere plane, there are instances where we see that, or which is rather mentioned, that when beings of, for example, the Rupa Vachara plane or the fine material plane or the immaterial plane, but specifically here the fine material plane, when thoughts of hatred arises. Now, hatred, they cannot feel hatred to the extent that we feel hatred. Point to notice, point of information. They cannot experience anger to the effect of how we experience anger. Our bodies are able to take up so much of anger. Our bodies can adapt to so much of anger. But in the fine material sphere, the beings who live within these fine material planes, because their bodies are so subtle and fine in nature, but rather because the consciousness is rather fine and more towards the jhanic absorptions and that wholesome practice, their minds are unable to experience hatred. And it is said the moment hatred arises, that they die and are reborn respectively according to their respective patisandhi or rebirth linking consciousness, which if it was something to do with anger, they're going to come crashing down into the either most probably into the woeful planes. Now, if we take, for example, the woeful planes as a way of understanding it a little bit more, now in the woeful planes, we see that beings are able to experience more pain than us. This is expounded by the Buddha in sutras such as for example, the Alavaka Sutta, the sutras pertaining to the woeful realms, which the Buddha expounds to sort of arouse a sense of fear towards wrong. Right, where the Buddha talks about the woeful planes, the hells such as Avicii, and the experiences that beings go through. Now, with regard to those certain types of planes, beings are able to experience more pain than we are able to. Beings have an accelerated rate of healing. Now, we do not have an accelerated rate of healing compared to those beings in the woeful planes. Now, that is to make sure that a person suffers more. Now, as I'm saying this, you might imagine, or you might think, is there someone who determines this? No, it is not determined by a person. It is very much determined by your own rebirth linking consciousnesses. You get what you absolutely want in your subconscious mind. For example, if we are to talk about rebirth linking very briefly, just to understand this topic a little bit more, when a rebirth linking consciousness arises during the time of death, right, during the process of death rather, during this process of death, the mind is quite weak, right? Depending, I'm taking an example. Let's take an example of when a person is ailing on a deathbed, right? When a person is ailing on a deathbed and suffering through the illnesses, suffering through the illnesses of whatever is causing one's death. Now, at this position, a person's mind is quite weak. So what happens when a person's mind is quite weak? It is as if uh, a monkey or an animal that glides or jumps from branch to branch is trying to sort of run away from another animal that's trying to kill it. It will grab hold of any branch that it would see. Right now, we have the ability and the capacity to be able to decide what branch am I going to jump onto and cling on to. We have the ability right now. But at the time of death, what happens is our minds are in a state of desperation almost. Desperation almost. One could maybe now in the mornings, now people who are quite grumpy in the mornings, right? Now, people who are quite grumpy in the morning. Now, sometimes people are not morning people. They are quite grumpy in the morning. They are quite, with the grogginess and all of this, they are quite grumpy in the morning. Now, they have allowed themselves to sometimes grow into a habitual pattern where when one has just woken up, one doesn't fully wake up, but rather depends on the coffee or whatever that you feed yourself in the morning, right, to wake oneself up. Now, at the moment of death, right, like a person who is not a morning person, who is quite sort of grumpy in the morning would sort of be agitated by whatever that arises. Similarly, what happens in one's deathbed is whatever object that comes with the agitation of mind. If you're running away from death, if you are fearing death, if you are if you fear the unknown, what will happen to me, what will happen to my money, what will happen to the future of the family, all of these things at the time of death, this agitation that arises is an agitation that comes through a hatred rooted consciousness. And when it is a hatred rooted consciousness, there's more probability and propensity for the mind to cling on to an object that brings one hatred. Right? So because our minds are weak, we do not touch it in a very sort of subtle way. We grab hold of it with all the might that we possibly could, because of our minds being at a position of desperation, right? Being at a position of desperation. That is why within the teachings of the Buddha, before we move on to that, we can also note that many religions in the world has very much capitalized on this treatment of death, right? Or rather, I won't say we, because I'm not doing that, but what the sort of the false, rather the practice has been. Now we can see it in the West. People don't like to talk about death here, right? People do not want to talk about the inevitable end, right? That is a deal breaker. Even for example, if we are, or if I am to give a talk, right, we have to be able to put it through in a very subtle manner. Why? Because people are just not used to talking about death here, right? But there is a grave danger that we put ourselves in by not talking about it as well. Because when we are or find ourselves in a position where we are weak, where we are ailing, where we are about to die, we do not have the ability of mind to deal with this experience of death. That is why now in the experience, now we have spoken of in the previous class, or I think in the Sutra class, but we have touched upon it in Abhidhamma as well. We have spoken of the corpses meditation, right? Now, whilst the corpses meditation is developed to let go of the greed, attachment, moreover the lust that we have, the raga or the lust that we have to the bodily pleasures or the body itself, this also sort of hints to the mind, or sort of gives us a clear understanding of the fact that this is a position that we will always have to face down the line of life, right? It also has that effect. It teaches us, it allows us to understand. Also, now within the teachings of the Buddha has taught us not to fear the next life if one does not have reason to fear rebirth, if one has led a good life. Now that is the confidence that we have. Now when with experience I have in many instances heard, and many people have told me itself, Bhante, I have nothing to fear. I don't do a lot of charity, but I also don't do anything bad. I earn, I feed my family, I feed myself, I'm educated, I've educated my children. So Bhante, now that is a cocky attitude, right? You are in a state of delusion, right? If we are living in this world, all of these consciousnesses which belongs to the sense sphere will arise. You will have patterns within yourself, even speaking from the attitude that you have displayed to death. Even with that sort of displays a sort of delusion that you have created in your mind, right? That is one point that has to be shed light upon. The other being, it does not matter whether you do bad. The mind will always be attracted to things which is then a greed-rooted consciousness. The mind will always be or have the potential for some sort of agitation to arise, which will always be within the hatred-rooted consciousnesses. And if greed and hatred arises in your mind, if you have a mental tendency to experience these sort of mentalities over and over again through one's life, which we as people living normal mundane lives, we have now sort of seen them as sort of normal human characteristics. And the Buddha points us in the same direction to say greed, hatred, delusion, non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, the three bad roots and the three good roots are both characteristics or foundation pillars of human consciousness, right? Because of that, although you might not be doing anything wrong, now that is again how we classify wrong, right? We have to do things which are good for oneself, also in a wholesome manner, also for other people, to energize our minds, to energize ourselves in terms of developing a higher concentration, higher ability of consciousness to dwell in an ability to arise consciousnesses which are non-greed, non-consciousnesses that are rooted in non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. The three roots which are essential for a human birth. Essential for a human birth. The moment that you tell someone, I do not do bad, why, I don't do charity and all of these things either, I don't believe in it, right? But I'm taking care of my family and all of that. That itself, look at the attitude. That itself is a lack of wisdom right there. That itself is a lack of wisdom right there, right? That is why in this practice, let us take all of the spiritual, all of the ancient traditions, they all speak about doing things for another. It is the simplest understanding within someone who is spiritual. We must do something to ease the pain and suffering of other human beings in the world. The Dalai Lama speaks of it all the time. All the time. The Buddha has spoken of this time and time and time again. The practice of dana, the practice of sila, and the practice of wisdom are directly associated with, for example, purifying oneself. But not only that. Now, for example, if you are the father or the mother of the family, or a child, whoever you are within a family, now you are practicing morality on your own. You do not give two hoots about the others, right? Let them do their thing, right? Now, I know there are complications when it comes to influencing people, but the complications, we are not talking about the complication, the attitude, right? Where you try to help them. That is important for the purification of one sila, right? For the purification of one sila, you must not do it. You must also not instigate others to do it. You must also give and share your wisdom with people in a way that is subtle and easy to bear with, not being pushy and all of that, but in a way that it's easy to bear with. You should also instigate others to practice. That is when your morality is strong, right? That is when your your morals are strong. The strength of the morals are strong. When we can experience such states when we meditate together, when we do a group meditation, you feel stronger. Similarly, strong in a way that you can meditate for longer. It seems your focus is better, right? Because you're in a class, someone's doing it for you. You have to just practice, and there are other people as well, and you want to stick on to the class, and all of these reasons, it makes your practice stronger. Likewise, doing something for another is very, very important. Then, so within the Kama Vachara Chittas, we have 12 unwholesome consciousnesses, right? Divided into 3 subsects based on the roots by which it arises, 8 of which are rooted in greed, 2 of which are rooted in hatred, and 2 again that are rooted in delusion. We have gone through this. We have gone through this. We know that greed and hatred do not arise in one consciousness. Greed arises with delusion. Hatred arises with delusion, and delusion can arise on its own. Then we have the rootless consciousnesses. The rootless consciousnesses are those consciousnesses that support the 5 sense bases to operate, right? That support the 5 sense bases to operate. They are like the residue or the weaker karmic results of the consciousnesses, or rather the karmic actions that we perform. Each karmic action that we perform, for example, if I am to again take my famous bottle and throw it at someone, right, and throw it at someone with rage and anger to inflict pain, this action, from the moment that I pick up with the volition to hit someone, and when I complete the action by throwing it at someone, this action develops a series of karmas, not one, but a lot of them, right? But a lot of them. This will become much more clearer when we come to the chapter on Chitta Vritti, the mind processes, because we are going to speak about the impulsions or the javana, which produces these karmas within a mental process. Now, these mental processes, a lot of mental processes has to arise to enable me to pick up the bottle, to aim it at someone and throw it. Also having the bearing which before I picked up the bottle, the reason for my anger was also processed in the mind. This could include hundreds of processes from the moment that I am to sort of turn my head to look at the bottle, and then to sort of imagine how much of strength I need to pick up the bottle, to move my hand to pick it up. All of this has consciousnesses prompting or enabling this process to happen. We know the moment the mind is not there, the body is dead. The body starts rotting the moment the consciousness is absent. Now, this consciousness keeps the body going. These consciousnesses, the karmas that are developed by these consciousness processes, also, whilst there are karmas that are quite significant in power, there are also consciousnesses that are quite weak and only can arise as in a way to support either wholesome, rootless consciousnesses, which enables one to see, smell, hear, taste, feel objects that are intrinsically, remember, intrinsically pleasant. If you say objects that are pleasant, that is wrong. Intrinsically pleasant. Why? Because, for example, to us humans, feces would be something which is really unpleasant. But to maybe, maybe to an animal, to a worm, to some sort of other insect, whatever, it might be something which is really pleasant. But because the element is intrinsically unpleasant, it has the basis of something. It has the basis of something which is now the basis or foundation of something which is unpleasant by nature. Now, let us take something which is, let's take a spicy curry, right? Now, us Sri Lankans, we love a good spicy curry. Right? We like spices and chilies in everything. Now, I do. I don't know about these old timers who've been in the UK for so long, but I do, right? So I think we all generally do like a bit of spice in our food. This is coming from our Sri Lankan roots, right? Now, to an English person or a person who is not really used, American and English, a European, a French person, they would be frightened by the amount of chili sometimes that we put in our food. So, but the food would not be something which is then intrinsically unpleasant. That would now come to the way that you are conditioned, right? Which is to do with the kiriya or the functional consciousnesses in the ahetuka or the rootless consciousnesses, right? Where the manodvara avarjana or the mind-adverting consciousness. And then we have the panchadvara avarjana, which is the five-door adverting consciousness, which its primary focus remains to just turn the scope of mind to an object which is now present within one of the five sensory bases for cognition. If there is a loud sound at the door, my mind will automatically turn to that sound. I was not anticipating a sound. I did not know that there was going to be a sound. The sound was a shock and surprise to me as well, right? But because an object arose for impingement within the ear base, my mind now turned. That process happens so fast that you sometimes think that all the sense doors are awake at the same time. It is not. It is not. Now, this will become clearer when we discuss about objects in the chapter regarding the processes of the mind, right? So let's put it off up until then, right? Where we discuss great objects, very great objects, weak objects, and all of that, right? Atimantaramana, Mahantaramana, and Kuddakaramana, and all of that, right? We will discuss. So I will guide you through all of that in time to come. Then we have consciousnesses. We have consciousnesses that are wholesome, rootless consciousnesses. We have consciousnesses that are unwholesome, rootless consciousnesses. And then we have consciousnesses that are functional consciousnesses, which includes the Hasitupada consciousness. And what is the Hasitupada consciousness? The Hasitupada consciousness is a consciousness which arises within the mind of arahants, or enlightened beings, which enables enlightened beings to smile, because their smile is not a smile which arises with greed or any form of attachment. Their smile arises from the most beautiful place of heart, arising from a mind which has no impediments, cankers, and hindrances. So we have 7 unwholesome consciousnesses. We have 8 wholesome consciousnesses. We have 3 functional consciousnesses. And then we come to the consciousnesses which are beautiful. These consciousnesses are consciousnesses which then arises. A loving arises when a person has developed a karma in the past or is about to develop a karma in the present through action, where all 3 or 2 wholesome roots are present. 3 or 2 wholesome roots are present. What are the 3 wholesome roots? Non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, right? Non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. 2 or more of these consciousnesses must be present for a beautiful consciousness to arise. In the beautiful consciousnesses are categorized to 3 sections. The first being the wholesome beautiful consciousnesses. And then we have the wholesome resultant consciousnesses. And then we have the wholesome functional consciousnesses. The functional consciousnesses are those, again, please remember, all functional consciousnesses other than the mind-o-adverting and five sense-o-adverting consciousnesses are experienced only by enlightened beings. Only by enlightened beings. What is the reason for this? Because now it is because the consciousness that arises within me when I do an action is able to produce a karmic result which could affect my rebirth. For an arahant or an enlightened being, this is not so, because the rebirth will not be affected, because the mind, being devoid or free of any sort of hindrance, is unable to develop enough karmic energy. Do not say no karmic energy. There is always energy, right? There was a time that everyone was saying arahants develop no karmas. No, that is wrong. Arahants do develop karmas, but we do not space or significantly say that it is karma, because karma, we have sort of understood, or the cultural understanding which comes through karma is, in a way, we've understood as karma vipaka, right? I will repeat that point. Culturally, the way that we have understood karma is more through the definition of resultant rather than the action itself. It is, I think, only now that we are really speaking about karma as the action, and then seeing a degree of difference between the action itself and the karma vipaka, which is the resultant of this action. This action is enabled by energy. The energy that I, for example, again, throwing the bottle at a person to inflict pain, that karma is developed by an energy, and that energy is something that can produce a rebirth linking consciousness, because I am still attached to the world. But within the arahant, this energy is weak. Not to say that the arahant is weak, but it is weak in a way that it cannot produce a rebirth linking consciousness. That is why all consciousnesses that are functional, except the five-door adverting and the mind-door adverting consciousnesses, are able to develop, are only able to be experienced by a arahant. We have 24 beautiful consciousnesses, 8 wholesome beautiful consciousnesses, 8 wholesome resultant beautiful consciousnesses, and 8 wholesome beautiful functional consciousnesses. These consciousnesses either are have the feelings of pleasure, somanassa, or equanimity, right? Or equanimity, upekha. The differentiation begins at with knowledge and without knowledge, which then says whether we have 2 roots or 1 root, which is wholesome. So 3 roots or 2 roots of the wholesome consciousnesses. The 3 roots would always be when there is wisdom. Well, in the Pali Chitta, it says Jnana Sampayutta, and when it is Jnana Vipayutta, or without knowledge, it signifies, or rather speaks of a consciousness with only 2 wholesome roots. 2 wholesome roots. And then we have the fine material consciousnesses. The fine material consciousnesses, there are 15 fine material consciousnesses. These fine material consciousnesses arise within the plane of Rupa Bhattara, or the fine material sphere. These fine material consciousnesses are directly associated with meditative absorption, These meditative absorptions are referred to in Pali as jhanas. Within the Abhidhamma technique of understanding, we have 5 jhanas. Within the Sutta technique of understanding, we have 4 jhanas. It is the same. The only difference being that that in the understanding of Abhidhamma, we go deeper in a sense of understanding where a jhana drops initial application and is left with sustained application. And then we go through a pattern of practice where we dump the sustained application and move on to zest, happiness, and the rest of the jhana factors, right? So that is the only differentiation there. Please do not think that there is a disparity between the teachings. It is only there because of the greater detail that the Abhidhamma sort of is available in, right? Now, the fine material sphere has 3 categories: the wholesome resultant, and the functional. The wholesome chittas are experienced at the moment of engaging or activating or entry into a jhana, right? Into an absorption. These absorptions arise with 5 jhana factors. One could also say 6 because of upekkha, equanimity. But the 5 jhana factors are vitakka, vichara, piti, sukha, ekaggata. Vitakka being initial application, vichara being sustained application, vitakka, vichara, piti being zest, sukha being happiness, and ekaggata being one-pointedness. At the 4th jhana, we are able to move on from happiness and one-pointedness to a more equanimous feel where it is now equanimity and one-pointedness. Equanimity and one-pointedness is the last and the 5th jhana, and also the basis of the rest of the arupa jhanas that arise. Sometimes you find in certain documents regarding Dhamma that the jhanas are referred to as 8. Now, when you see this, you will predominantly see this within the Sutta Pitaka or the canon of the sutras. You will see the number 8. Do not get confused. It relates to all the jhanas in one category, right? Also, please understand or note, point of information. In certain studies, in certain doctrinal studies, one could also understand that the arupa jhanas are sometimes spoken of as a part of the 5th rupa jhana, right? So it is sort of spoken of as a different state of mind, or rather a higher plateau with regards to the absorption, if you understand what I mean. A higher plateau, when I say a higher plateau. This is because the jhana factors which are existent within the 4th or the 5th, we are talking about Abhidhamma, so the 5th jhana and the rest of the 4 arupa or the immaterial jhanas all have the same 2 factors: equanimity and one-pointedness. Right? I hope you understand that point. That is why in certain doctrinal studies, when you engage with the suttas, you will sort of see the word or see the jhanas numbered as 8, right? Numbers as 8. Now, numbers at 8. Moving on. Now coming into immaterial, right? Coming into immaterial. Page number. Page number 60, please. Page number 60 on the Comprehensive Manual of Abhidhamma. To those of you who are new, the link to the Comprehensive Manual of Abhidhamma is available on the dhammacenter.uk website under classes. So, page number 60. immaterial sphere consciousnesses. We have 12 immaterial sphere consciousnesses. 12 immaterial sphere consciousnesses. The first consciousness type or being, the immaterial sphere wholesome consciousness. This type of consciousness is developed, of which there are 4, is developed during the time of engagement or entry into the arupa jhana or absorption. Arupa jhana or absorption. Now, with regards to the arupa jhanas and the rupa jhanas, let's go back to the rupa jhanas. We have discussed how we flourish from one jhana to the next. How do we flourish? We find the gross natures within the jhana, and then we start with the understanding. Now, we do not do this at first, but with the understanding, as we develop mastery upon these jhanas, something that we do is we understand the features of the jhana to a clearer, deeper aspect. And then when we do, we know of the flaws of the jhana, which allows one to then be able to let go of the jhana. But how specifically is one able to let go of the jhana? Now, with the grossness that we have, for example, with regards to the first jhana, the vitakka and the vichara, right? The vitakka and the vichara, the initial application and sustained application. The vitakka and the vichara, the initial and the sustained applications, when they are present with the grossness of the jhana, we find ourselves in a position where now, in a state of mastery of the jhana, we are able to understand the jhana in its finer sense, and with this understand the grossness of the jhana. But because of the existence of wisdom, because it takes wisdom, prajna, even for us to sit down and get into the practice. So with the existence of wisdom, we are able to see the world and the jhanic attainments and the way that we achieve our jhanic attainments in a deeper, more subtle sense. For example, the Buddha, knowing the dangers of unwholesome deeds, has taught us not to commit, not to have tendencies or the potential, or to get rid of one's tendencies and potential, which would lead to an action which is rooted in unwholesome, Now, the Buddha has taught us that within the Dhamma, because he sees the depth to which it could carry us down, weaken us, pull us down to the wholeful realms and planes, the suffering that one would have to go through and endure because of one's past actions and deeds, right? We go through a lot of suffering in our lives because of our past actions and deeds, sometimes with regard to the habits that we have, sometimes with regards to the lack of ability, with regards to the ability that one has to let go. We go through a lot of suffering. That is no secret to any one of us, right? That is no secret to any one of us. Now, with that, the Buddha has taught, because of his amount of wisdom, the Buddha, seeing all of these things happening, arising and passing away, he has told, do not, or train the mind to come away from unwholesome and devote the mind to a wholesome practice of life, to care for people, to be compassionate, to develop wisdom, all of that, right? All of that. Understand now, when you are at a stage where you have mastered your jhana, your absorption, you are in not a similar, but you are in a state higher than the state of mind that you had before you produced your jhana, right? Before you produced your jhana, even if you were a devout practitioner of meditation, mindfulness, even if you know the Dhamma inside out, right? Yet, by the practice and experience of a mental absorption, one's experience and understanding of the grave tendencies of unwholesome is now at a greater level, with which one is able to now see the danger of vitaka and vichara. Right? The danger of vitaka vichara. Just imagine, for example, vitaka vichara is the prime reason for unwholesome states such as doubt, such as restlessness to arise in the mind. These states are delusionary states. They cause delusion, they cause blindness of the mind. And because of which we will again see ourselves pulling ourselves down to a state of unwholesome natures or states of unwholesome nature. Now, when we let go of, or when we attempt to let go of the gross tendencies of the first jhana, this wisdom can come very much in handy to let go of the attachment that we have to vitaka initial application and sustained application. Let us now come back to, I just wanted to know that, let us now come back to the arupa, the immaterial sphere. Now in the arupa, right, we have the first state of arupa being the state of akasananchayatana kusala chitta. The akasananchayatana kusala chitta, right, is the wholesome consciousness pertaining to the base of infinite space. Now what does that mean? Now what does that mean, right? So akasa, let us look at the Pali word akasa, space. That is literally what the practice is about, space, right? Now this space, we are not referring to the space of, beyond our atmosphere, right? We are referring to the space existent at the absence of an object. The space, I'm going to repeat that, the space existent at an absence of an object, right? Now, for example, I have a secular light here, right? Now, for example, if it is this, right? So if it is this, right? Just imagine now this, focus on this. Now this can be something like the kasina, right? Now in the practice, we remember when we practice the jhana initially, we took, for example, let us think of this as a light kasina, right? Now this is the primary object which has enabled you to attain the 5 previous jhanas or absorptions, right? Now what you do in this practice is, because now this light is a material object here, right? This falls under a material object, right? This light in space, what do we focus on? Now, as you are looking at this light, right? As you are looking at this light, now this really does look like a light cousin actually, right? So as you focus upon this light, right? What you focus upon is now when you look at this, right? Now this object, the nimitta that we call it, the nimitta, which currently is in our mind. Now when you close your, if you have reached the jhana states, if you close your eyes and you sort of advert your mind to the object that you have developed the 4 jhanas by, right? The 5 jhanas by, this object will reappear in your mind. Now at that time, what you do is, when you are trying to now leave behind the material, the fine material jhana, and access the immaterial jhana, you have to get rid of this sign now, right? You have to get rid of this sign. So what would you do? what you do is, when you look at this, you do not advert yourself to the light, neither do you associate it with the light, but you focus on the space, the absence of the light. Or rather, you do not focus on the light at all. Do you understand? Right? You do not focus on the light. So when you're looking at this, what you look at is not the kasina, but of course towards the kasina, but not adverting to the kasina, but you advert as space, space, space. And you do not take any consideration of this nimitta that is there. Right? Now also understand, for one who has really felt the pleasure of this nimitta, it can be very hard for one to let go of it. That is why one will not be able to advert to the immaterial jhanas without adverting to the last of the fine material jhanas with the aggregate of equanimity. Right? With the aggregate of, or rather the jhana factor of equanimity. Right? Which will not allow one, because it is such a fine state. Right? Now, for example, let us think about, so basically now when that happens, what happens is, then this disappears, and then you have a space, right? The complete absence of an object, and that becomes your primary base for the immaterial consciousness. Right? The immaterial consciousness. Right? So for those of you who are wondering how Bhante is so fair, I have two lights here. Right? So don't hate on me. Right? So so with regards to the now a person who has developed the five rupa jhanas and is now paving way to attain the arupa jhanas, now one's understanding in mind is so important and beneficial to one now. Right? Why? Because the greater the Dhamma understanding that you have, all of these teachings about anicca, impermanent, suffering, non-self, all of these teachings about the aggregates, the arising and the passing away, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Noble Paths, the cause and effect. Now, if you have this knowledge, this practice of jhana can be very easy for one. Right? Because that knowledge also helps you to let go and develop the basis by which you can let go. And the more that you meditate, all of this polishes up. Right? It polishes, and you have a greater understanding regarding all of these attainments and all of these subtle states of mind. Subtle states of mind. Now, when one is trying to do this by let go of the rupa jhanas and attain the arupa jhanas, now what one focuses on is not specifically the grossness of the jhana, but now you need a little bit more, because the fifth jhana is a very pleasant state. Right? Is a very pleasant state. Almost, it could be almost impossible for one to really find fault with it. Right? It is such a, think of a polished shoe, a perfectly polished shoe. Right? A leather, maybe a cordovan, or a good sort of hide. Right? A good polished shoe with a nice shine on it. Right? Absolutely perfect. It is very difficult to find something wrong with it. Right? Something like that. Now, the state of mind at the fifth jhana stage is something of a very beautiful experience. A very beautiful experience. Right? Now, it can be quite daunting to even imagine finding fault with it, because it is such a pleasurable experience. Now, how can you find fault with it? Now, you have to find fault with it somehow. Right? How do you find fault with it? How you find fault with it, or rather, not to say find fault, but rather to sort of be more aware of the weakness of the jhana, is there is the existence of or connection to something which is material, right? There is the connection in the Rupa jhanas, there is a connection to something which is material. What is that something? That something is the nimitta, or the acquired sign, right? Or the acquired sign. This nimitta is something which is or has been gained through a sort of attachment that we have to the rupa. For us to progress into the immaterial, then what must we do? We have to note that any sort of attachment to the material plane can cause suffering, right? Now, how does anything which is rooted in materiality cause suffering? With the attachment to materiality, what arises is the potential for us to fall, for hindrances to arise. Now, that is one point, right? If we are attached to something that is impermanent, then that attachment that we have to something that is impermanent can cause suffering, That is one point, right? Now, this, you can have different examples. With regards to this, right? With regards to this. Now, let me read to you one of the examples mentioned in the path of purification, the Vishuddhimagga, right? Suppose a timid man is pursued by a snake in a forest and flees from it as fast as he can, right? As fast as he can. Then he sees in the place he has fled to a palm leaf with a streak painted on it, or a streak painted on it, or a creeper, or a rope, or a crack in the ground, right? Meaning, what they are saying is something that looks like a snake, right? Something, a rope. Now, to those of you who have doubts whether your houses are haunted, right? Even the wind is is something that scares you, or a shadow, right? Or a shadow. Now, this is what it's talking about here, right? This is what it's talking about here, right? Or a crack on the ground. He is fearful, anxious, and will not even look at it, right? And will not even look at it. Suppose again a man is living in the same village as a hostile man who ill uses him, and on being threatened by him with a flogging and the burning down of his house, he goes away to live in another village. Then, if he meets another man there of similar appearance, voice, and manner, he is fearful, anxious, and will not even look at him. Right? And will not even look at him. Right? Now, this is the attitude. This is the attitude by which we then sort of bridge ourselves to the rupa, or I'm sorry, arupa, immaterial jhana, right? So you can understand, for us to have, right? Now, this might have been a little bit difficult for the rishis of the past and those who meditated without the Buddha's Dhamma to understand impermanent suffering and non-self. With what is mentioned in the teachings, it would have been quite difficult, right? But now, with the practice, with the teachings, it is much more easy, because we have a better comprehension of pain, suffering, what and everything else to do with it, right? That is the attitude that one must have towards the attachment that we have to the object or something to do with the material plane. It is very similar. This is also the type of fear that one must have towards unwholesome in sort of more basic practices of meditation, in more basic practices of meditation, right? So as we develop, when we go through, as we develop, as we go through the Drupa jhanas into the Arupa jhanas, what we then do according to Akas Sananchayatana is we focus on what I just mentioned. We arouse a sense of fear towards this. Now, let us go down. Let us go down to page number 62. Immaterial sphere consciousness, arupa vachara chittani. This sphere of consciousness comprises the chittas pertaining to the immaterial plane of existence, arupa bhumi. 4 realms in which matter has been totally transcended and only consciousness and mental factors remain. Rebirth into these 4 realms comes about through the attainment of the arupa jhanas, the 4 immaterial or formless absorptions, which are reached by developing concentration beyond the 5 jhanas or the 5 material sphere. The immaterial sphere consists of 12 chittas, the 4 wholesome chittas, and with which the immaterial attainments are experienced by worldlings and trainees. The 4 resultant which arise through rebirth in the immaterial realms, and 4 functions which occur to arahants who enter upon the immaterial attainments. Right? That is very clear. Right? The kamma or the initial entrance into the jhana is experienced through the wholesome consciousnesses, which is the first section. The second section, or the wholesome result, or the immaterial resultant consciousnesses, are experienced by a person who gains rebirth within the immaterial sphere, and the functional is experienced by the enlightened beings who enter upon the arupa jhanas, right? Enter upon the arupa jhanas. Now, akasanan chayatana. The first of the 4 immaterial jhanas is the attainment of the base of infinite space. To reach this, a meditator who has mastered the 5th fine material jhana base on kasina object spreads out its counterpart sign of the kasina until it becomes immeasurable in extent. Immeasurable in extent. How does this happen? Now, when you have the nimitta, right? When you have the nimitta, or the counterpart sign as we call it in English, right? The counterpart sign is again as the same as what you attained in the first jhana, or what you attain to reach the first jhana. What you do, right, is you spread it out. You spread it out. Now, there are a couple of techniques how you can do it. This is one of the techniques that are mentioned as well, right? So was the technique which was mentioned previously. This technique, you spread it out. Now, to those of you who have meditated, to those of you who have seen certain lights, you know that there is a scope of vision in your mind when it comes to these lights and other experiences. We understand that, a scope of vision, right? Now, to those of you who have not experienced it, now if you close your eyes, and then now you have your mind, right? With the awareness of mind, you have this sort of scope that you sort of have in your mind. Imagine now, as I'm looking at a light, I can see the light. Now this light, right, which is a counterpart sign, what you can do now, this counterpart sign, as I told you, by the time we reach the 5th attainment or the 5th jhana, it is very pristine. It is very pure. Why is it so pure and pristine? Because the hindrances are that much suppressed. So the light is pristine and clear, and there are no impediments in it. So you are able to also play about with it, like a ping pong ball almost, right? Like a ping pong ball almost, or something that you can absolutely, you can turn it into shapes and colors and sizes and all of these things. And something that you do is you stretch this out to sort of fill the whole scope of vision of mind, right? The whole scope of vision in mind, right? And this you clearly do with a sort of determination of sorts, where you tell yourself, or you command yourself rather, to sort of spread it, and it does spread, right? And it does spread, I'm sorry. And it does spread. Contemplating, right, spreads out the counterpart sign of the kasina until it becomes immeasurable in extent. Then he removes the kasina by attending only to the space it pervaded. Right? Now here, now the kasina could be of a bright nature at this point. Bright, not like a bright light, right? That we would, for example, the light in front of me, not like a fluorescent light or something like that, or LED light flashing in your face. No, a very profound glowing light, sometimes very much comparable to the sun, sometimes very bright. Some people even find it difficult to look at it, right? But of course, by the time you reach the fifth jhana, you have sort of got rid of all of those fears and anxieties, and you are in a state of stability, so you can look at it. But it is a stable, bright, light colored light. Light colored, what I mean is tones of light yellow or light orange, right? Tones that are light, right? And it is a light of that sort. More than a light, it is a formation, a clear, distinct formation, more than a light at this point, right? And this you spread out, and when you are engaging or looking at it, it's the same way now, without adverting to the color or the quality of this object or the counterpart sign. You now, the space that you have stretched it out to, you focus on space, right? So this is a situation where you are neither adverting to the elements of the counterpart sign, neither are you adverting to use having stretched it out, neither are you adverting to the color or the features of it. You are adverting to none of that. You are only adverting in a way that you now comprehend space again and again and again. And at this point, if we have the right attitude, the process could be quite smooth, right? The process can be quite smooth. Also, there are different physical changes that one could experience at this point as well. There can be certain rumblings of the stomach. There can be effects such as diarrhea. There can be certain effects, and this is because of the mind now sort of reaching a higher state of mind and the letting go of the rupa or materiality, and it has a effect upon the body as well. And this is, don't worry about it, this is not long term, this is only very, very temporary, right? So the diarrhea will go away, right? Right, the diarrhea will go away. So don't worry about it, or don't fear the diarrhea. Just don't think about it at all. But something that we often do at this time is we meditate in our own kutis or our own lodgings to enable us to run to the bathroom when we do require it. Right? Now, these are practical aspects. These are practical aspects actually of the practice as well. Right? So you will undergo certain sort of changes of body during this time as well, right? Now, there eventually arises in absorption a chitta having an object, the concept of infinite space, or akasa panyate, the expression base of infinite space. Strictly speaking, refers to the concept of infinite space that serves as an object for the first immaterial sphere consciousness. Now that point is very important. Akasa panyati. Now this is a concept that we create in our minds so that now the mind would have something to base its practice on. Again, clinging on to something. We are clinging on to a concept now, but this concept, because it is something developed within the mind, it is something that is much more finer and subtle compared to the object or the counterpart sign that we use to develop the rupa jhanas or the material sphere consciousnesses, material sphere absorptions, right? It is of a much finer attribute or aggregate, right? And the infinite nature of this concept comes through, the spreading of the counterpart sign in all directions, right? Now this, of course, this is all for your information at the moment, but it is important to understand the way that these immaterial spheres operate. Now, also a point of information that you might have noticed is now we let go of to develop the jhanas, we practice a certain amount of sacrifice with regards to the sensual pleasures, etc., which enabled us to let go of, or rather cut or subdue, not cut, but rather subdue or suppress the 5 hindrances, which allowed one to attain the 5 rupa material absorptions, the 5 material or the rupa absorptions. We had a part to sacrifice in the sense sphere plane, which enabled us to access the consciousnesses pertaining to the fine material plane. Now, to access the immaterial plane, we must sacrifice certain things in the fine material plane, right? Now, what we are sacrificing it for is a concept, a created concept, right? Which is mind-born and also much, much more finer than anything to do with materiality, right? As we now progress now to develop onto the lokottara or the supramundane plane, which deals with the attainments themselves, we must now let go of the concepts that we have borne in mind, right? So imagine this process that you go through, right? This process that you go through, specifically, this very much, what I have just said, very much applies to the attainment of arahanthood, right? Could also pertain to the attainment of non-returner as well, right? Non-returner as well, because those are states of enlightenment that are absolutely pristine, right? Absolutely pure. Whilst now attainments such as, for example, stream entry are more grosser states of mind compared to those higher states of achievement, right? Higher states of achievement. That is why, as a Sotapanna, now today I was having a conversation with a lady who sort of called me for a couple of things and also to wish me for the birthday. So something that, so we obviously, with me, I get chatting. So so with that, we were just speaking about the practice, and something that she said, Bhante, I want to get into the practice, but I'm thinking of my children. And I was like, no, what is, your children are not going to go away, because remember that when we attain to stream entry, we are still able to live with all of these things. We are still able to live with our businesses, our work, our friends, our family, all of these things. But of course, your lifestyle specifically will be different, but you're not going to leave them and dump them by a road, and you are not going to have the house for yourself, or you're not going to disappear into a forest, right? So, but it seems now this lady was a Sri Lankan lady, of course, with the culture that we have been brought up in, with the Eastern sort of philosophy of Buddhism, right? The way that we attribute ourselves when we speak about attainments is, or nirvana is, we completely attribute ourselves to the stories that we've read, to the enlightened beings themselves who lived in forests and all of these things. Obviously, to your mind, you living in a house or a flat, right? In a house or a flat or somewhere, basically a house where which you call your own, right? You're not going to sort of leave all of that, or you're not going to be demanding to sort of get rid of all of that from yourself at this moment. But you must allow yourself the confidence, allow yourself the capability, allow yourself the position to say that I do actually want to achieve nirvana, that I do actually want to achieve a state of enlightenment, right? And do not think of that enlightenment, have enlightenment, but have this understanding of what enlightenment is. We attain enlightenment, we attain enlightenment 4 times, right? 4 times through each sort of level of sainthood. And people like, for example, something that I always like is Vishaka, right? Who was one of the disciples of the Buddha, one of the chief female disciples of the Buddha. She attained to the stream entry path when she was quite young, right? She had many children. She was married to a very, very, very wealthy family beyond comparison. And with that, she managed businesses, she managed the taxes, she managed the merchants and all of these things as well, whilst being an enlightened being who was a stream enterer. Vishaka was a stream enterer. She also, something that I've also mentioned to you, is one moment when she, before she built her monastery to offer to the Buddha. How did she build that monastery? She wore a diamond and jewel encrusted garment, right? A bedazzled garment to the temple, right? To the temple. And she, before she served the monks, because there was work to do, Vishaka sort of removed this garment. It was not the only thing that she was wearing. It was an ornament that sort of draped her whole body. And she removed this garment. um, and she placed it on one side. To those of you who think this is impossible, I actually, there was a garment of a similar sort that is explained within the Tipitaka, that Vasashi put out in 2017, where it was a bedazzled sort of with Swarovski crystals, and it sort of draped the whole body from head to toe, right? So that reminded me of this statement of where this garment that Vishaka wore. And she removed it and she kept it in the side. And something that is with the practice is, when you leave something or when you offer something to a temple, especially when you offer something to the religious people or to a monastery, you do not ever take it back, right? You do not ever take it back, right? Now that was a strong practice, and it was a strong part of the culture. How degrading is it to ask something back, and how degrading would it be when you offered something with pure heart to a monastery, to a whole sort of clan of Sangha. And so she did not offer it, she just laid it by the side, but she felt so guilty that she bought it back. It was one of a kind. So what she did was she bought it back rather than just taking it back. And with the money that she bought it back with, she made another monastery for the Buddha, right? Now, that information is just information. What I'm saying is, now Vishaka being an enlightened being, why on earth, if we would think, why on earth would she wear, this to a temple? Right? Why on earth would she be wearing a bedazzled garment to the temple? she was very much, like I'm not saying that she was a normal person, but she had certain hindrances, defilements within herself because she was not fully enlightened, for sure. Right. So please understand, when we talk about enlightenment, we are not always talking about, where you become an arahant. We're talking about at least stream entry, and have the confidence that you will be able to, maybe you'll be able to be an even better mother or father or carer or partner to whoever that you're with, being an enlightened being, right? Being an enlightened being. So with that, I'm going to wrap up the session today. If there are any questions that you would like to ask, now is the time that you may ask any questions that you have. If you, I will give you permission to unmute your mic if you want to, and ask a question if you have a question. So if no one has a question, then yes. Yes, Dil.
Things, Bhante. First is when you are referring to the Jhana, and in the Abhidhamma way, where you have 5 jhanas as opposed to the 4 jhanas,
Yeah.
and you drop the vitakka, and when you drop the vichara, I think you may have said something I may have heard. I think what you meant is that when you drop the first one in the Abhidhamma, what you read is, I think you referred to doubt and restlessness, but I think the first is Tina Midda and the second is doubt vitakiccha. Because it's the third one that you get the restlessness and the last one the vyapada. So I think what you meant was you drop the first Tina Midda when you drop the first, and the next one was doubt. I think you said doubt and restlessness. Maybe I heard it wrong, but
yeah, I said doubt and restlessness.
Yeah, but it should be Tina Midda, the soft and top, and then
soft and top. What are you talking with regards to?
When you go from those factors of you drop those jhana factors. So you first drop vitakka, then you drop vichara, isn't it? And
yes.
in that fine motor, in that fine Rupavachara world, when you're talking, what you said, what you do is you suppress the hindrances one by one. So when you drop the first thing, the factor, the hindrance that you drop is Tinamidda, and the second one was doubt, which is vitakiccha, as opposed to vitakiccha and uddhagoputta. In the book, that's what it is.
No. What I was speaking, I was not speaking about the hindrances. I was not speaking in that regard. I was not speaking about hindrances. I was speaking about the roots.
Right.
Right. And the rooted consciousnesses.
Right.
Right. But yes, of course, with the hindrances, it would be another story. But yes.
Okay. So
yeah.
Right. Thank you. And then there was something else. You were referring to now in the fine modes of consciousness. We normally say there are 15 of them, isn't it? So you have 5 of them, and 5 of them. The wholesome ones, the resultants, and functionals. Correct? As opposed to in the immaterial ones, where there's 4 and 4 and 4, which is different. Correct? So when you count the jhana.
Dil, you'll have to come closer to the mic, or.
Okay. So when we are looking at can you hear me now? I'm shouting.
Yes.
So in the fine material, normally we have 15 of them, 5 and 5 and 5. And in the immaterial, we have 4 and 4 and 4, we have 12. But you did refer, though it's 15, that sometimes you talk of 8. So that means what you're talking about when you talk about 8, it's a somanasa, that the whole...
8 with regards to when we study the suttas.
Yes.
Or some example, the books like the Vishuddhimagga, for example, it talks about 8 jhanas.
So why is that?
It is because the again, now we have 4 jhanas in the sutta,
yes.
Right, and 4 jhanas in the arupa,
yes.
Right, the rupa and the arupa. So there are 8, right, and sometimes so there are 8. So basically there are 8 jhanas.
Right. So the chittas are different. There are 15 of those images.
So the thing is, the jhanas in the suttas, they don't break it down to rupa jhanas and arupa jhanas. They talk about 8 jhanas, right? In the Abhidhamma, we break it down to the arupa jhanas and rupa jhanas.
Right. I think I misunderstood. So that was jhanas you're referring to as 8. But the chitta,
Absorptions.
there is 2. See, I was one, because if you look at the fine motor, the 15, there are 15, there are 5 wholesome, there are 5 resultants and 5 functioners in the root.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what
No,
I mean.
we were talking about the jhanas.
Thank you, Bhante. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. Thank you.
All right then. All right. So thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to ask the question, or are we able to wrap up and continue? Good. So I think we are able to wrap up and continue. Thank you everyone for the wishes. The devotees of Colchester were so kind to sort of organize a secret collection of dry rations and all of this, and and it was such a pleasant surprise because they came at around 12 o'clock and they took me to the homeless, the food bank, and with all the donations that they had collected from the people for. And we had, I think, more than the donations that we did from the food bank before. We had so much more donations that people sort of had given in, and I felt so happy that they had done it for the homeless. So thank you everyone for the wishes. Thank you for the wishes, and I will see you all. Have a pleasant rest of the evening. I will see you all next tomorrow, and yes, pleasant time of practice. Good night and goodbye.